So you've read Matthew and Mark, so this is the last of the Synoptic Gospels. As you're reading it, what were your distinctions, impressions compared to the two M's? What did you find different about or unique to Luke's Gospel that you hadn't seen or that stood out to you from your other readings?
I feel like Matthew had the most weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah. No, that's a popular Matthew phrase. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We'll talk about how
That's a go-to. That's a go-to for Matthew. Mm-hmm. It's not that Luke doesn't talk about it.
right, but not as much. And Mark is the least. Is that
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And the woes.
Aha! Tell me about the woe.
Well, I think the most distinguishing factor about the woes to me is that Jesus never does it to an individual. He's always doing it to groups, whether it's the people of a town or whether it's described to the Pharisees or whomever. But I have always found that intriguing how he does his admonitions. And if seems like to me, and I'm going too far on this, but it seems like that if he will admonish one, like say Nicodemus, that is done in private, or Peter, or it might be some other disciples there, but mostly not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the woes I love the woes.
Very, very strong. I mean, there's some interesting dynamics there. You have the chapter 5 where you have about 5 stories in consecutive fashion where people are watching Jesus carefully, where the people are complaining that Jesus is eating with Levi, scum of the earth. People are distraught and indignant that he would allow this sinful woman to touch him and kiss his feet, that he would dare heal on a Sabbath in the synagogue. And then Jesus, you notice, I hope, maybe the order of events in Luke's, I mean, they're same events that Matthew and Mark record, but Luke changes the order so that Jesus is talking about the log in your eye and the speck and judging others right after all those people have been critical of what he's doing and who he's including. And you notice that Simon's mother-in-law, Jesus is healing her at the house, but we haven't met Simon yet. And then he's at the house of Simon, healing his mother-in-law, but then he's on the water side calling the disciples. And I'm thinking, okay, these are out of order, but you have the healing stories in succession, and then the calling, and then who's included in this calling, and then the vindictives of how dare you question who's going to be included into this, or if you question it, I'm going to challenge you when you question it. Who's in and who's out, kind of thing.
And the Beatitudes are, blessed are the poor in spirit, but woe to you who've had a good life, in essence.
No, in spirit in Luke. They dropped the in spirit, right?
Yeah.
Poor, blessed are you who are poor,
Yeah.
who are thirsty now, and then, so the Beatitudes are different in focus into physical and real material poverty, impoverishment, and then the geography is on a plain, which we talked about, instead of on a mount, going with that equality or equal access to God. Great. Other things that might have caught your attention that we didn't see in the other two synoptic gospels, things that might be unique to Luke's gospel. Some of those were.
We get the story behind John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. Wow. This gospel talks about John the Baptist a lot. In fact, the gospel starts off with John the Baptist, right? And the parallel between Sarah and Abraham. Both these two people are old, barren, no chance. She's going to become pregnant. Angel of the Lord appears. He dismisses it. I mean, it's almost the exact echo of that Old Testament story. John's ministry is described in detail, and is going to, and then you see these two things. I hope we talked a little bit about it when we did the birth narrative of Jesus in Luke chapter 2, right? We have, Luke starts off, Augustus is emperor, Cyrenius is governor, and there's Joseph and Mary. What? Who are these people? And then later with John the Baptist, when he's talking about John the Baptist's ministry in chapter 3, Tiberius is emperor. And then the tetrarch, Pilate's over the governor of Palestine, and the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas and his brother Philip and his sister Lydia. And they're all in charge. And while they're doing that, John's out in the wilderness preaching. So Luke is talking about power, always talking about earthly power, earthly wealth, earthly understanding of what makes success, and this great reversal. The low are going to be brought up. What matters to God is not what matters to people. And so you have this is what's happening in the world. You know, the headlines across Fox or CNN or whatever news story, the BBC flashes, and this is what God is up to in the midst of all the chaos. That's pretty cool. Other things that you see in Luke's gospel. Two of the most famous and most preached texts in all the New Testament. The Lord's Prayer is in here. It's a little different than Matthew's, right? Yeah. But I'm thinking the two stories that I guarantee all of you, if you've been to church, have heard. Prodigal son, yes. Luke 15 and Luke 10, the Good Samaritan. Welcome, Dick. So you have these two texts that are only found in Luke's gospel. And really powerful parables. I think it's always important to think about who Jesus is talking to and why he tells the parable. So the first one is talking about, hey, it's an inclusive piece. Who's my neighbor? But he's a lawyer and he wants a loophole. Wanting to justify himself because Jesus says, what do you find in the law? Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Maybe not. Look at that. Anyway, the lawyer says, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Bam, you got it. We just talked about it on Sunday. Yes, good, do that. You're on your way to eternity. But I need some clarification because I don't really want that to be what I think it means. So who counts as a neighbor? Because I need to know who I need to love and who I can just kind of, you know. And then Jesus tells him this crazy story. And I say crazy because in the modern times, it would be like this. Your local pastor drives by a family that's stranded on the side of the road. It looks like they have been in a crash and they are bleeding and they have been left there. And everybody's just ignoring them. And your local pastor walks by because they're busy. And then deacon of the church, you know, somebody runs the community kitchen, nobody in present company included, sees them and, but I got to go pick up some food for the kitchen, so I'm not going to stop. And then a skinhead comes down the street and sees them hurt and stops. And I say that because to the Jewish people that Jesus is talking about, there's no good Samaritans. If you were in Israel, you'd be talking about a member of Hamas. If you were telling the parable in Palestine today, if you were in Gaza, you'd be talking about maybe an Israeli soldier. What? And this person shows the love of God because they did what was merciful and right in the moment when nobody else would. It's a shocking story to somebody who wants to not have this mean fully what it means of who is my neighbor and who's not. No. There's no who's not. is the point of the story to the man who wants to know, what do I got to do to get to heaven? That's a pretty edgy story. Then we got the lost son, right? The prodigal son. Again, it's a scandalous story, right? In a Jewish home, it's patriarchal. Dad blesses. Dad gives the family farm. Dad gives the birthright. For a son to say to dad, I can't wait till you're dead. You're dead to me now. I just want to go live. Give me whatever you were going to give me now. It doesn't matter if the family needs it or not. Just give it to me because I want to go live my life. Today, we'd find that offensive. To do that to your father in first century Palestine, you're as good as dead to the family. I mean, you don't do that, right? So this is a ridiculous story of Jesus. Nobody in Jesus' I mean, I'm sure there's a few people in town that people would think of when they think about an irresponsible, reprobate son. That's this person Jesus is talking about. So the kid goes off, blows everything, goes to Vegas, blows it all on fast living, and not just playing the tables, doing everything. Stays in Vegas. Yeah, it happens in Vegas. Anyway, but the family hears about it. Older brother hears about it. Dad hears about it. And this kid, comes down on hard times. He is eating pods of pig food working for a swineherder. That's an unclean job no righteous Jewish person would ever take, unless you're desperate. It's the only thing you can do. He decides enough's enough. He hits rock bottom. I'm going to go home. I'm going to say, I'm sorry. I'm not worthy to be a son anymore. You're right. Everybody in town would agree with you. Your family would probably agree with you. Before you can hit the door, the dad in the story runs from the porch, gives him basically a family credit card. His signet ring is his signature to do whatever you want with a family wealth. His robe. He is a son. He's a treasured son. Everybody's excited. He throws a party. The wording is intentional. He was dead, now he's alive, which we'd think is the worst thing, right? I thought he was dead. Now thank God he's alive. But the greater thing is he had lost his way, and now he's found. So this is a spiritual piece. We call it the prodigal son, the lost son, right? The grace of the son. But really it's misnamed, I think, because there's another brother. It should be called the parable of the eldest brother. Because why is Jesus telling the story? All right, so we got to go back, and if you turn to Luke 15, you'll see in 15:1, some tax collectors and other notorious sinners were coming to listen to Jesus teach, and the teachers of the law and Pharisees complained that Jesus would dare associate with these folks. And as they're complaining about who Jesus is associating with, he tells them the story. Okay? Context is everything. These guys are upset that Jesus would deign rub shoulders and elbows with these people who shouldn't be in church, at least not our church. People who we would not want to be seen with our friends. We would certainly not have them to our house. And Jesus says there's an elder brother who is beside himself in anger that the dad would give this kid a break and forgive everything this kid's done. After he dragged the family name through the dirt, he has treated them like trash, and yet the dad is still willing to take him back in open arms. And the eldest brother will not go inside. The dad comes out begging, pleading, please come home. your brother was lost, he's found, he was dead, now he's alive, come celebrate with us. And his response, that son of yours, not my brother, that son of yours, after all he's done, how could you forgive him? And you haven't even given us, a fattened calf to party. I've been here the whole time, and you're going to give that guy a pass? Teachers who've devoted their whole life to God. Suddenly these people they've known their whole lives, and they've known him as X or Y or Z, and now Jesus is going to say, yeah, God loves you. Yeah, you can be part of this. No, we're not on board. Nope. We know what the kind of people they are. So, you have these stories of powerful inclusion, but you also have an edge of judgment, right? You have Jesus attacks people pretty powerfully in this gospel. Who's he attacking? The woes, the teachers of the religious law, the Pharisees, the scribes, the tax collectors. I'm sorry, not the tax collectors, the scribes and teachers of the law. Because,
Wealthy, the greedy.
yeah, people who are very wealthy. Rich man and Lazarus. The parable of the bigger barns. Jesus, in Luke's gospel more than any other, the power of wealth to corrupt your soul. Love of money is the root of all evil. It's not love of money. I mean, it's that if your wealth replaces God, then you'll never have enough, and you'll also run the fear of being disconnected from those in need around you, because all you're starting to care about is what you've got. And you start to become less generous with others. And those are the kind of warnings Jesus is teaching about in this gospel, that greed would consume you and become your God. And in Luke's gospel, it's 1 in every 10 verses he's talking about, on average, talking about greed and money. And so rich, poor, big themes in this gospel. The bigger barns and rich man and Lazarus, they're not in the other gospels. Don't find that stuff. Okay? And we're able to read the notes about liberation theology and how this gospel tends to be really a key gospel for, especially in developing nations or poorer countries, because if you think about, so much of this gospel says you might not ever have any kind of power or wealth or fame in this world, but God sees you. And what is now is not the way it will be. Those of you who are last in this earthly life will be first before God. Even if people discount you and put you on the margins now, you'll have a place with God. So it's kind of a Robin Hood-esque gospel in some ways. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, I noticed that the Bible Project kept going at the upside down kingdom.
Yes.
So is that a common reference to it, or?
Yeah, or the Great Reversal, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you see that right off the bat, right? Mary's Magnificat. He has lifted up the lowly, like me, and he has taken the princes down from their thrones and exalted the lowly. So again and again, this gospel talk, and you notice when John the Baptist is doing his ministry, we have a detail we don't have in the other two synoptics. People, he says, repent. It's not enough to say we've got the pedigree, right? We're children. We can trace our family lines to Abraham. We are 100% the tribes of Israel. He says, no. I don't care who your family is. God can make descendants of Abraham from these rocks. What God cares about is how you treat each other. And so the people then panic. Well, what do we do? And be generous. If you have 2 coats, give one away to somebody who needs it. If you are a tax collector, don't collect more than you're due. Treat people fairly. If you're a soldier, don't Don't exhort people or use force to manipulate a relationship with somebody. Don't treat people that way. And so it's very much about how you're living a godly life versus, and that's where John's judgment comes down. So it's, again, Luke puts on that layer of it matters how you treat each other in a very powerful way. So, yeah, very much so, this reversal. Dave, back to you.
There was a couple instances where I thought where it was, maybe it's the translation, but the wording seemed like confusing to me. It's like the opposite of what you would think. Like in 14, he's talking about the cost of discipleship.
Yeah.
Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, even life itself, cannot be my disciple.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, wait, didn't you tell me I have to love everyone? But now,
Yeah.
you know, your family,
Yeah.
just totally disown, or I'm not sure what. Maybe
Yeah.
it's the translation there, but.
I think it's hyperbolic language. Like, you can't love anything more than you love God. It's not that Jesus is encouraging you to, cut off relationship with your family or hate your family. But those are really radical teachings. Like he says, a guy's talking about following Jesus, but he's got to bury his father first. He's like, well, don't give me any excuses. And you think, wow, that's pretty harsh. Jewish law dictates you have to see them in the ground before the sun goes down. That's your obligation as a son. And I think the point of that, and these are tough teaching, right? The point is, following God has to be, you got to be all in. Doesn't mean, I don't think Jesus really didn't have compassion on somebody who lost their child. But I think I would hope this is hyperbole language that
But you might have to abandon your traditions that you've been following.
you might have to, it's going to cost you something. It's not free. It's not without sacrifice. It's not without, not everybody's going to be happy if you live the life Christ calls you into. Not everybody's going to understand the things that you're living into because of who Jesus is, or the things that might change in your life because of who Jesus is. And if nothing changes in your life, then you're really not following him, I think is what he's saying. You don't go fight a war if you don't first consider how many soldiers you have. He said, think about, a lot of times when we have confirmation Sunday, I said, this isn't just a ceremony. You're not done because your parents made you go to class and you graduated. You don't ever graduate from being a disciple. That's not what this is about. It's a way of your living your life, and it is different. You're swimming countercultural to the streams a lot of times of what is valued in culture in terms of fame or wealth or popularity, or what gives a person value. And you said sometimes the things the world says gives a person value aren't what God believes about value at all, about humanity. If that makes sense. Yeah, it is shock value talk, right? I mean, imagine, we also have, and I'll come back to you, Dave, because you said you had a couple. But look at, chapter 11, he gets invited to the home of one of the Pharisees for dinner. And, imagine sitting at this table. He intentionally doesn't wash his hands. And I think, because you just don't do that if you're living in Jesus' time. You don't, the mikveh is right there before you go in the house. That's what you do. You wash your hands. It's like taking your shoes off, or knocking before you don't just walk into somebody's house, right? It's what you do. So he doesn't do it, and they say, why don't you wash up? This isn't how we do things. And he uses it as an opportunity to attack their superficial faith that is, judgmental of others, but doesn't really do anything real or genuine in their spirit. And then the teachers of the law say, well, you're insulting these guys. You're insulting us when you talk like that. And he said, you're dang right I'm insulting you too. And you guys also. And then he goes down the litany in this. I mean, imagine, these are the hosts that have invited him. And they're expecting maybe some kind of debate or conversation. They're going to get a debate all right. I mean, have you ever been in an uncomfortable dinner? I mean, Jesus leaves no prisoners at this table. It's no wonder why people in the religious order team up to want to get him out of the way, because I think Luke gives us a little bit more insight on some of the ways he rubbed people the wrong way. But it's also interesting because you get these moments like later in Luke's gospel where the Pharisees come and tell him, hey, King Herod's sending soldiers to come kill you. And what's Jesus' response? Where is that? Hold on. It's in 13:32. Jesus says, tell that fox that I'll keep casting out demons and doing miracles and doing everything I'm doing today and tomorrow and the next day. He knows where to find me. I mean, this is not Mark's gospel where he's operating in the shadows and don't tell anybody what I've done here and who is this man. This is a different telling of the story, right? So it says, tell that fox where I'm at. Go ahead. See what happens. Dave, did you have another example of it that you wanted to throw out?
I can't find what the other one was. And you mentioned one of them, but no, I can't find any others.
Okay.
Scott,
Yeah. Go ahead,
This is my
Dick.
own problem. But between the prodigal son,
Yes.
the one guy went off and just,
Yeah.
went wild.
Mm-hmm.
The other guy stayed at the home digging for the farmer.
He's a good
doing
kid.
all the work, great guy.
Mm-hmm.
And the father says to when they get back together, but you always had everything of mine.
Mm-hmm.
But of course he didn't. He lost a quarter of it when the guy blew it.
True.
But shouldn't that standard of doing and supporting the family, building shouldn't that be a condition that makes that favorable?
So, okay, yes. But remember, a parable isn't meant to be a literal 100%. It's not meant to be a historical or factual life lesson for every point that it tells. A parable is a story usually that has a piece of it that makes no sense in everyday life. It would be different than what is normal in everyday life. And the difference is usually the place where Jesus is going to make a point about God or about how we should treat each other that is in contrast to what you'd expect. So think about a parable as almost like a Shakespearean play, where the devices of the play are put together to get to a specific place in either a tragedy or a surprise comedic ending. But the parable, remember in the parables, it's not always, the figure is God. I mean, look at the shrewd manager. Like Jesus is talking about this guy who basically goes around his boss after he knows he's going to get fired, and he cuts slack on all the accounts so he can get something to show his boss that he's actually working. But he's gone around his boss's back. It would be gross insubordination, and he's, would you really want this guy working for you? No. But Jesus' point is talking about how if a person in business is cutthroat and laser focused and willing to do even ruthless practices to get ahead, how laser focused do you have to be in the work of the kingdom of God? Would you want this guy as a business partner? No, that's not the point of the story. It's a parallel to a faith teaching. Of course, you probably wouldn't want the younger son. You'd be grateful for the older son. But he's trying to tell a pointed shock value story to these teachers of the law who are really put out that he'd have anything to do with people that they don't think a good church or good faith person should have anything to do with. And his point is, God will have things to do with people that you can't imagine, A, because you probably don't know the whole story, but B, God's a lot more merciful or graceful than you or I. And you guys in your judgments are not giving these folks, you've given up on them a long time ago. God hasn't. I think that's more the point of the story than trying to determine whether the honor roll kid or the dropout, whatever, it's going to make them wrestle with really what's going on in the situation is what he's trying to do. Does that make sense? I mean, this kid is not the poster child of, this is not for family therapy. Jesus doesn't tell the story that so he can have an intervention when a kid, goes off the rails. Tells it for a different reason.
I also like the sequencing of the story. The prodigal is the third after he's talked to the people and he's upset with them.
Yes.
It starts with who wouldn't have 99 sheep, and the shepherd would go after the one that got lost. That the shepherd's going to do that. And in some ways, I look at that a couple of ways. He's talking not just to the people he's upset with, but he also wants to encourage the people of the lesser level, that I understand why you do this because A, you love your job or you love your sheep. You're not going to let anything happen to them. This is how God's going to care for you, though they're not getting it yet. And then he talks about a woman who's lost a coin, or 3 coins, or however many coins. Anyway,
Yeah.
she's lost a
Silver
precious
coin,
coin.
yeah. Mhm.
Might be the only coin she ever has, nothing else to eat. And she's sweeping and looking all over, going crazy trying to find that coin. And when she's finding it, she's rejoicing. Well, who wouldn't rejoice when they saw that? And then comes the son who got lost and wasn't doing anything right,
Yeah.
and comes home. And the father, what father wouldn't be delighted, And then the side story, but I'm delighted with you too, which when all of those come together, God's
Yeah.
delighted with the whole,
Right. Yeah.
It's, for me, it helped. It softens the older son a little bit when I think of it that way.
For me, it's very much like the story of Jonah.
Yes, I would agree with
At the
that.
end of the story, we don't know if the son comes into the party or not. Jesus doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
And in the end of the book of Jonah, Jonah's out, waiting for God to rain down fire on Nineveh. And the prophet book ends in a question. Jonah, is it really right of you to be angry that I'm merciful in the city of 100,000 people you consider your enemies? Question mark. Whoever's reading that, got to ponder that, wrestle with that question. Does the older son come in? Will he create room in his heart for his brother that he's said is not my brother anymore? It's up to the people he's talking to and to us.
The people who are the judgmental ones.
Sure. Yeah. They have to wrestle with it.
Yeah.
We have, there's so much in Luke's gospel. So I take other questions before we get to the last week of Jesus' life. I saw Lynn, then I saw Dave. You guys can rock, paper, scissors if you want. I know you got to go home together.
Bunch of Dave.
Go ahead.
I want to talk more about the shrewd manager, because this is something I think we never talk about this.
Yeah.
This parable.
Yeah.
This verse 9, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. What?
And in my version, that's what I was going to ask about. It says dishonest wealth.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to hold on that, not because I don't think it's a great question, but because I know I've done a lot of study on this text, and I'm not recalling it in this moment, and I'd like to tackle it well, because this is a really tough text, and I think anybody reading it says, "What? This is weird, right? This is an unusual story. It is Lucan only, but again, about money." But dishonest money, what? Yeah, the guy's the crook. You wouldn't want to work him for you, but he's using it as an example of something about discipleship. So what's the translation? What's that mean? Are we supposed to be dishonest in the ways of? So yeah, I don't think that's what it means, but I don't remember all of it. So let me take like a drill down on that one. So
The rest of it makes total sense, 10 through 13, but it's saying.
there's a lot of stuff in Luke that is like, what's going on here? Good question. We're going to hold that one, though, for beginning of next week. Anybody else? Have any others? You got the persistent widow. There's another one that's, yeah. Pharisee and the tax collector. All these are unique to Luke's gospel.
Seems like there were more parables in Luke than in the other two.
Matthew has a lot, too. I don't remember which one has more, but they're the two parable gospels, right?
Yeah.
Mark has none. John, I don't think John has any. I don't think John has any parables. So I think it's Mark and Luke, or Mark and John. I could be wrong. Mark may have one. No, Mark has the sower, I think. But Matthew and Luke, lots. So yes, Zacchaeus, wee little man was he. The wedding banquet, all kinds of good stuff in this gospel.
I don't think anybody gets kicked out of the banquet in Luke's telling, like they did in Matthew.
It's a different. I don't know that the king goes and burns the towns and puts them all to death. I don't think that happens in Luke's gospel. Yeah, Luke has a softer edge in terms of the judgment parables, for sure. Okay. Then let's get into the time check. What do you got, Dick, as far as time? 10 after. Well, yeah. All right. Let's get into the Passion then. The last week of Jesus' life according to Luke's gospel. So, start in chapter 19, goes through the end of Luke's gospel, and we have so we got basically 5 chapters. We have some really interesting things that happen in the final week of Jesus' life. First, we have the, I know we've talked about this before with the other Gospels, but just the synoptics tend to have the temple cleansing. Jesus' his polemic against the temple is that the leadership has made it a place of hiding their misdeeds and their corrupt religion and unfair practices. And it's their base of operation. They've turned what should be a house of prayer for all people into something that's elitist, that is exclusionary, and they're getting wealthy off of it as well. Whereas in John's gospel, we'll see that the placement of the temple cleansing is right off the get-go, chapter 2 instead of the end of Jesus' life. It doesn't happen in the last week of his life, according to John. And the money changers are in the sights of Jesus because they're cheating the people and being a distraction in the courtyard, and so they have turned it into a marketplace, not a den of thieves. Different scriptures are quoted, and the theological point of the temple cleansing is different based on the gospel writers. Everybody follow me on that? So it's a good example of where when people say we're studying the Bible and you just blend all the stories of the last week, maybe many of you have been to, the 7 last words of Jesus, and we just cram them all into one service on Good Friday, and we read them all, and then we kind of tell the story, which is great. There's some good things about that. I know that happens in a lot of places. the con to that is each gospel writer is writing through a lens of what they want to highlight about the life of Jesus. And so I think the temple cleansing gives you a good idea. Like, John is going to cast the lens in this way, marketplace. Jesus is going to use that moment as a sign to point to who God is. In the synoptics, it is the last straw. Jesus is full on attacking publicly the temple complex and its leaders. You have turned this into something, faith. You've turned Israel's faith leadership into something it's never meant to be. You are the corrupt shepherds of Ezekiel 37 who take and trample the water and eat all the food and leave nothing for the rest of the sheep. You are those people. And that's the condemnation of the temple. And that's part of why Jesus is tried and killed, because he's attacking them, right? Okay. Any questions about that before we move from temple to, okay. All right, so of course, people are going to challenge Jesus' life. He gets those stories that we had on Sunday where the Herodians attack him, the Sadducees attack him, trying to find loopholes to discredit him. All the while, all this is happening around the temple. Luke's gospel has Jesus in Jerusalem more than the other two synoptic gospels. There's so much centered in Jerusalem because the temple is going to be a really important part of Luke's telling of this gospel and the central place, the central thing that he's attacking in this gospel and challenging. This isn't what God intended. So he's rewriting Jewish faith and what it should look like, attacking the very source of the base of operations of faith. So it would be like if Jesus went to the Vatican and said, to the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops, these are the things that are wrong. That's the kind of similarity, okay? Parallel. But here's where I really want to get into the differences of Luke's gospel. So when you were reading the Passion, the final week of Jesus' life, are there any details that you thought, this is not what I remember about Jesus' death or resurrection in Matthew or Mark? I know that's a big question. Maybe that's too big of a question. Let me ask you this. All right, I'll make it sharper. When Jesus is killed, he's killed with two other people, right? Three criminals. In the other two Gospels that you've read so far, what did they do? The two criminals.
They were thieves, weren't
Yeah, thieves or killers, depending on which of the two Gospels we're talking about. One says they're thieves in English translation, or bandits. Other says they're insurrectionists, which means they've fought against Rome. They're traitors to the state. In both Gospels, they deride Jesus, mock him, and one of them in each case says, hey, if you're who you say you are, wouldn't be too much trouble. They say you can walk on water. How about you get us out of here? If you got this power, let's see it. Luke includes a story where he shows two very different thieves. One mocks Jesus just like in the other two Gospels. But then Luke changes the story, or whoever includes this in Luke changes the story. And he has a second one say, we deserve this. And it's a theological tool. It's not just in the story, right? It's anybody who's looking at the cross event, comparing what Jesus is doing to whoever's reading it. We deserve whatever punishment. This man's done nothing wrong. I want you to hear this as a theological lens, because Luke is framing Jesus' death When the centurion talks, he says, this man is innocent, blameless. This man's done nothing wrong. I see no reason that he should be killed, Pilate says. So Jesus' innocence, there's no talk of atonement, no talk of sacrifice. Who's Luke writing to? Gentiles, non-Jewish people. People who might be attempted. You know, the Greeks and Romans also had temple sacrifice, but the idea that something had to die and blood had to be let for forgiveness, that's not where Luke's going. So instead of saying, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? This idea that Jesus is taking on all these sins, and because he's taking on all of our sins, he is the sacrifice, dies on the cross for our sins, saves us from punishment and wrath because he can. Okay, so that's the atonement of Matthew and Mark. Here on the cross, Jesus looks at those who have crucified him and who have put him on the cross and says, what? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So here is, I know I've maybe talked about this once before, but here's the difference. Atonement says, Mark owes me $400 billion in debt, and he can't pay me back. But Pam's got a very wealthy Bitcoin thing going on, and Pam says, even though Mark has no money at all, Pam says, listen, you can't pay that debt, and you're going to be in debtor's prison for the rest of your life. You'll never see your family or your grandkids again. I don't want that to happen to you, so I'm going to take on your debt, even though to almost break me, I'll pay for what you owe, so you don't have to go through it. I'll take it on. Atonement. I'm going to take what you can't possibly pay. Jesus is going to take what we can't possibly pay. Forgiveness is this. You owe me $400 billion. You owe it to me. I'm the one who's missing it. But because of who I am, I can say, you don't owe me a nickel. I forgive the debt. Is it going to hurt me? Yeah. But I have the power to say you don't owe me anything because I was the one who gave it to you. Forgiveness is God forgives because God can. There doesn't have to be a bloodletting. Jesus isn't casting off God's anger. It's a different way of understanding the death of Jesus. Now, are they both saying Jesus was redeemed through the death of Christ, we're saved through the death of Christ? Yes. But theologically, they're talking about two different things. One requires a sacrifice, one doesn't. Well, in both cases, God is taking on the burden of it that humanity can't bear. But in one, the death has to happen for the blood to cover the sin. In the other one, and I think this is an important point, the other one, in the face of human cruelty and ugliness, God says, I still am willing to forgive you in your darkest shadows. So there are two different theological points. They're not saying the same thing. They both believe in the crucifixion of Jesus. But again, let's not blend it together. Luke's understanding of the crucifixion is very different than Mark's understanding of the crucifixion. It's not that it's not important to them both. It's just they see it differently. Okay? They're not the same. Yeah.
It's sort of a different focus, I think, and I support that with the commissioning. Commissioning is very different in Luke. Luke says, preach, I don't know if he uses the word gospel, as much as he says, just go out and proclaim repentance and forgiveness of sins.
Yeah.
Which is a whole lot different in the way it's nuanced, but it's more loving, more grace-filled than go and make disciples of everyone and teaching them everything that I told. One is a real charge to almost convert people.
Yep.
And the other one is saying, just let everybody know that they're forgiven you know, and no matter what,
Yeah.
God loves them that much.
Mhm.
And I think that's supported by the thing on the cross, you know,
Mhm.
the way he says, Father, forgive them.
Yep. Yep. They,
I was going to ask, to me, if here it is forgiven, there's nothing wrong. Jesus didn't do anything wrong, and I don't see anything we need to do with him. Who are the people who are so upset?
okay. So when Jesus comes in and tells the people who are basically, it would be like if Jesus came to the Pope, the bishops, the cardinals, and said, "You guys are living in this gold-plated Vatican while people are out suffering. You're out of touch with the people. You don't care about the people. You're hiding behind an office. And how dare you equate that with what God is really saying, what God's kingdom is really like? That's false. It's wrong." That kind of equivalent. So he's making them angry. He's making enemies of anybody who. So let me put it this way: if you, in the American Revolution, if you had a neighbor who was a Tory, who was reporting members of your family as unpatriotic to the king, you might have an issue with that family, your neighbors who are Tories. Jesus is seemingly giving a pass to the tax collectors who work with Rome, who are taking our farms and our family livelihood with our oppressors, and who are sometimes reporting us to the local Roman authorities. They are the Tories in our world. How can Jesus, a man of faith, associate with these scumbags? So he makes enemies of revolutionary people, of patriotic Jewish people, grassroots people who don't want anything to do with the Romans. He gets the Romans nervous because he's the king of the Jews. He's got this large following coming into Jerusalem during a Passover. And remember, anybody who is not Jewish but would be familiar that the Jewish people are celebrating God delivering Israel from Egypt's power. So there's this, 50, 100,000 people chanting this man's name, and they're celebrating God's deliverance from a foreign power. It's no wonder why they brought extra soldiers in, because they're the foreign power, right? So you've got all these three kind of things converging into anybody who's really got a lot of power and a lot to lose if Jesus were to become king, if Jesus' followers were to suddenly put down their palm branches and take up swords, we got a problem. This guy's got to go, right? Just like, why did people want Martin Luther King Jr. dead? Why did people want John Lennon dead? Why do people, attack somebody whose message is primarily peace? Well, because they're challenging things that a lot of people don't want challenged, and making enemies because of it, challenging some of our traditions, challenging some of our if you go and get into an argument today, say we went over to the library and we asked people what their faith affiliations were, and we started to challenge their faith affiliations, how do you think that would go? Right? So Jesus is challenging people's faith practices. Even today, that's dangerous territory. So yeah, there are people who hate him. There are definitely people who want him dead and succeed in that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there also something in between the difference in the Gospels about a comment on the humanness of Jesus? Because his last words are, in one, it's, "Why have you forsaken me?" Very human sounding emotion. as opposed to Luke where he says, into your hands I commend my spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a much more neutral or divine wording or something on that.
Yeah. So if you compare all the Gospels, like, I'm going to use John first, even though I haven't read John. So there's a very human side to it. I'm thirsty, you know. Take care of this. He's going to be your son now, and she's going to be your mom, right? Some very practical human things. But then at the end, it's finished. Like, this is not. It's hard to imagine Jesus actually saying that. Yeah, it's done. Now I'm dying. Maybe he did. But the theological point is that mission has been accomplished. Jesus has come to accomplish what he's done as the Son of God. Whereas, yeah, in Matthew and Mark, it's this, I feel so far away from you, God. Where are you in the midst of this ugliness? And Luke's kind of in between the two, right? He's got this divine proclamation of forgiveness that seems like be hard for a human being to be feeling that way after people have been doing this stuff to you. And then, yeah, it's kind of in control. I commend my hand. You know, I've been obedient. It's actually from the Psalm, into thy hands I commit my spirit. So it's this faithfulness in the face of enmity, which is, yeah, it's kind of it's kind of in between the two, the other Gospels. Great question. And then we don't really have much time, but the resurrection stories in Luke are also unique, right? We have this very famous Road to Emmaus story. You have the tomb, without quite the detail that we'll see in John's Gospel, with Mary Magdalene, Joanna here, and Mary, the mother of James, who we found out from Mark is Salome, who we found out from Matthew is the wife of Zebedee, who is James and John, who are Jesus' then first cousins, if you put all those pieces together. But the walk to Emmaus is really interesting because I'll just highlight that one because it is kind of the singular, unique one.
So were there three Marys at the crucifixion?
Mary Magdalene, Mary, Jesus' mother, and then Mary, the mother of
Okay,
James.
three.
Yeah. There's a lot of Marys. A lot of Marys. And it's also let's stay there for a second. So it's a really important thing, and it was brought up in the Da Vinci Code. Remember the Da Vinci Code, and was Jesus married to Mary Magdalene and all that stuff? Which is, I don't want to make light of that. It's a very strong possibility Jesus could have been married to Mary Magdalene. She's always mentioned first, which is how wives were often mentioned in texts. If they're mentioned, they're amongst a group of women. Usually they had a very close associate. The one's most closely associated with Jesus is going to be the one who's mentioned. And there are a lot of Gospels particularly Gnostic Gospels, that say Mary Magdalene was the leader of the church, not Peter. That Jesus, Peter, kind of pulled a man card over Mary Magdalene after Jesus died. But anyway. The point I want to make, though, here is on your questions of Mary and confusion around Mary, is that in this gospel we have in Luke chapter 7, Jesus is invited to the house of Simon the Pharisee. The woman who comes in, who's washing Jesus' feet with her tears, wiping them with her hair, who's poured perfume over him. We have that same story told in John's Gospel, and who is it? It's Mary, sister of Lazarus. All right? A pope took Mary, sister of Lazarus, and a sinful woman, and connected them with Mary Magdalene, who the only thing we know about Mary Magdalene in Scripture is that Jesus cast out 7 demons from her, from Luke's Gospel, right? But in preaching a sermon, I can't remember if it was Pius X or Gregory X, one of the two, said in the sermon, the power of a sermon, that Mary Magdalene is a sinful woman and a prostitute, because you wouldn't be letting a woman like that touch you. So puts Mary Magdalene in as the Mary, as the named woman who is unnamed in Luke chapter 7. And from that time on, even though nowhere in the Bible does it talk about Mary Magdalene being a prostitute or a hooker, she's been depicted in art, been depicted in church tradition as a prostitute. Not before that time, but about 10th century on, she's a hooker. And so all that baggage, and now we have the Da Vinci Code, and the scandalous, we don't want people to read this, because a woman like that couldn't have been married. Well, the Bible doesn't say she was a woman like that. It just says she was healed of 7 demons. But the power of a tradition that becomes, how we tell the story becomes a fact, but it's not biblical.
So we don't know if Mary's sister of Nazareth, or of Lazarus, we don't know if she was a 4th Mary.
I think she was.
She was a 4th Mary.
I mean, they're from Bethany, right? Mary Magdalene's name insinuates she's from Magda, which is not Bethany. I mean, they could have moved. They could have moved. They could have moved. People move. There's a lot of Miriams. There's a lot of Miriams in this time. I mean, it's like John. You know, it's a common name. So, could it be? Maybe. But anyway, sorry, we're probably out of time. The road to Emmaus, though, just in short, I mean, there's some things that are kind of fantastic about it. I mean, if you go to Israel today, they'll tell you Emmaus is in 3 different spots. One's 13 miles away, one's 11 miles away, one's 7 miles away. That makes a big difference as to if they're meeting Jesus and having dinner in the evening and then they hightail it back to the disciples in the middle of the night. 13 miles? I mean, I've run 13 miles. That's going to take you a while. And most people aren't traveling at night on the roads because it's dangerous and you could be killed. Anyway, the point of the story is they don't know who this man is. They don't recognize him physically. But in the breaking of their bread, they remember. And what did Jesus say as the Last Supper? Remember me. So the story is as much about after Jesus is dead, where do we see the risen Lord? At the breaking of the bread at the table? Where do we recognize Jesus in the stranger who tells us, who connects us? And so this resurrection story is not as, it's about them experiencing the risen Lord, yes. But it's also about the remembrance and where is the resurrected Lord present? Anytime we break bread together, anytime we remember who Jesus is, the Easter Jesus is present. So it's a double layer story that you don't really have in the other Gospels, but it's really powerful. And it preaches a couple different ways there, but I'm sorry, I've gone too long. I'm sure I'm over time. We are going to get back to the shrewd manager, though. That's a promise. I'll do some homework on that and hopefully maybe send you something also in the meantime that you can look at. But we'll tackle that before you jump into John's Gospel next week. So John's Gospel, not a synoptic, very different. Just a little highlighter before we get in for next week. The first part of the book is going to be very different than the first 3 Gospels we've read. Jesus' persona and presentation in public is going to be very different than the synoptic Gospels. John's Greek is very detailed, very rich in detail. But if you are trying to read it like a timeline of events of the life of Jesus, or any kind of historical, like this is the life of Jesus, you're going to be in trouble because it's a theological gospel. It's the latest of the Gospels. It's written earliest earliest probably 95 AD. So, you know, at least 60 years after Jesus is dead, probably later than that. You know, probably like 80 years after Jesus dies. So it's not meant to be a historical biography of the life of Jesus. It is meant to make theological points about who this author thinks Jesus is. And so you're going to have I am statements that you don't find anywhere else. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the true vine. I'm the good shepherd. And these are going to be highlights about who Jesus embodies. You're going to have these signs, water into wine, walking on water, raising Lazarus from the dead. And each of the signs is going to be a pointer to who God is, that Jesus is pointing to God. You're going to have public debates, a very different telling of the crucifixion. And for example, just really quickly, when they come to arrest Jesus, Jesus asks them, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. In the English translation, I could just pull my hair out, because they say, I am he, which is wrong. It's not what the Greek says. It's just flat out wrong. It's just terrible translating. The Greek says, ego eimi, I am. Who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth. I am. That's the name of God. That's what God tells Moses to tell the people. I am. I exist. And what is their response? They fall down. There's like a theophany, a divine moment there. John's saying something supernatural is happening. They're in the presence of God. It mirrors what Elijah does when the general sends the captains out to capture Elijah, and he calls down fire from heaven, and the 50 of them are incinerated because he's messing with God. Like, who has power at the arrest? It's not they come to take Jesus and they bind him, and the disciples are lashing out with their swords, and then they run away. Jesus says, I'm him. Did you have to come out with all this force? And he says, let these guys go. I'm the one you want. He's calling the shots of his own arrest. Nothing like the Synoptic Gospels. It's very clear as John tells the story, like Jesus, I should say God, in whom Jesus is the Word of God embodied, the incarnate, is in control from start to finish of the Passion. Like, human beings are involved, like Pilate. What is truth? He has no idea who Jesus is. You would have no power unless it were given to you. Right? They're all pawns in God's plan, is how John is going to show the crucifixion. Very different from the Synoptics. So have fun diving into John's Gospel, but just be aware of the different lens as you're reading it, because it reads very differently. And it will have some fun. Pastor Michelle's leading next week, but I will be here early to tackle that Luke 16.